This is Shenzhen in the present, and this is Shenzhen 45 years ago. The person who truly opened China to the world, initiating a series of policies and reforms that significantly boosted the economy and improved the living standards of the people. He is fundamentally the foundation of today's modern Chinese economy, a leader highly regarded by many politicians. That is Deng Xiaoping. It's the late 1970s in China. Mao Zedong has just died, and the country is in absolute chaos. Hundreds of millions of people, mostly in the countryside, are trapped in extreme poverty. We're talking about a situation where, if you look at China's own long-term poverty standards, the ones they use today, adjusted back, basically the entire rural population, something like 97 to 98%, is scraping by below a super low bar for basic survival. No exaggeration. Official stats from the National Bureau of Statistics show around 770 million rural poor in 1978. That's the brutal legacy of decades under Mao, the Great Leap Forward, which caused one of the worst famines in history, the Cultural Revolution, which tore society apart and wrecked the economy. Growth had stagnated. People were starving. The system just wasn't working. Now we should talk a little about how the leap forward works. Abolishing private ownership of land, agricultural tools, and even communal kitchens. Farmers are concentrated into very large communes of up to tens of thousands of people, where they carry out the targets set by the state and keep a small portion for their own food and seeds. Because they work collectively without personal development motivation, labor productivity and daily output increasingly decline, which is part of the famine mentioned in the previous section. In a small village named Tiaotang, Anhui Province, during the winter of 1978, 18 farming households secretly gathered in a thatched house, lit oil lamps, and signed a confidential commitment. They would divide the land among themselves for individual cultivation. If successful, they would be well fed. If they failed and were caught, the adults would go to prison, while their children would be cared for by the village. This was a nearly reckless act in that context, and a miracle happened. Just a year later, the rice yield of Tiaotang village skyrocketed, from not enough to eat to a large surplus. Rumors spread. Some local leaders were initially frightened, but then they began to tacitly allow other villages to follow suit. Deng Xiaoping heard about this. He did not rush to criticize or suppress it immediately, as many feared. Instead, he quietly observed and gradually supported it. He famously said a line that people would remember. Whether the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice, it is a good cat. His point was, as long as the method helps the people to be full and the country to be strong, just do it, without being bound by ideology. Thus, from 1979, the Household Responsibility System, also known as the Family Responsibility System, was implemented quietly and then publicly across the country. The state still retained ownership of the land, but granted long-term leases to individual households. They had to pay a fixed portion of their harvest to the state, while keeping the rest to themselves and selling it in the market. Suddenly, Chinese farmers for the first time in decades had a real incentive to work hard. What were the results? Truly overwhelming. In just a few years, China's food production increased by more than 50%. Rural areas no longer had queues for ration tickets. Surplus money began to appear, and farmers bought bicycles, radios, and then televisions. More importantly, tens of millions of rural laborers were freed, leaving their villages to work in factories that were springing up like mushrooms. This laid the foundation for the later industrialization miracle. Then, after 1983 to 1984, when the household responsibility system had covered almost all of rural China, Deng Xiaoping no longer pushed for major agricultural reforms like turning the chessboard over. He understood that the main breakthrough had been achieved. Farmers had motivation, were well fed, and it was now time to shift focus to industrialization and urbanization. But he did not neglect the countryside. Instead, he quietly adjusted and reinforced what had been done, so that agriculture would not lag behind while still supporting the larger picture. First was the deregulation of agricultural prices. Previously, the state bought agricultural products at a low fixed price, and farmers, even if they produced surplus, did not profit much. Next was the extension of land lease terms. Initially, the contracts were only for 15 years, and many farmers worried that they would be collectivized again in the future. In 1984, Deng allowed for extensions, and then in the 1990s, even though he had retired, the policies still followed his line. The contracts were extended for another 30 years, and later even to long-term stability. He also tacitly allowed the transfer of land use rights between households, not complete private ownership, but enough to give farmers confidence to invest long-term in their fields. Another important change was the explosion of township and village enterprises. TVEs are enterprises in villages that were granted preferential loans from rural banks, tax exemptions for many years, and allowed to freely buy raw materials and sell products at market prices. They could hire flexible labor, specifically young farmers who had just left the fields, and pay wages based on productivity, no longer the iron rice bowl. Most importantly, TVEs were allowed to form joint ventures with foreign companies, especially in areas near special economic zones, to learn technology and export. This was not purely an agricultural reform, but it directly stemmed from the countryside after the household responsibility system. Surplus labor was no longer bound to the fields, and surplus money from agriculture was poured into small workshops, making bricks, weaving fabric, processing agricultural products. These TVEs sprang up like mushrooms in coastal rural areas, attracting tens of millions of farmers to work part-time. Deng strongly supported this, seeing it as a way to industrialize without the need for immediate urbanization. Thank you very much for watching the video until now. The truth that I think this video is really bad to start a journey, but I want to upload it because I made it a long time ago and didn't post it. From now on, I want to be serious about sharing what I want here. Finally, let's continue this journey together and share knowledge to help each other improve.